Let's turn to our next passage, Psalm 9, verses 4 through 8. The Tanakh, the Old Testament, establishes over and over in several places that God is the judge. Look at Psalm 9, starting in verse 4. The psalmist says, "For you have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne giving righteous judgment." And the root word for judgment there is shofet, right here. Strong's number 8199. And this again is the same root word that translates over as krinon, or judge, or something like that in the Greek. The psalmist continues in verse 5. You have rebuked the nations. Notice the scope of God's righteous judgment. It's not just with Israel, but it is with the nations. You have rebuked the nations. You have made the wicked perish. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. God can render judgment over all the earth because he is the creator, something we also learned in our Shema study. The psalmist continues in verse 6. The enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. Their cities you rooted out. The very memory of them has perished. Why? Why has this happened? Because the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for justice. There's that kingdom theme all over again that we learned in our Romans study. God is the righteous king, and he establishes his kingdom here on the earth, ultimately, and he establishes his righteous king. Notice in verse 8, the psalmist concludes, he, God, judges the world with righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness. What's the scope of God's judgment? It's over all the nations. It's over all the peoples. It's over all the world. It's not just over Israel. That's the point I'm trying to bring out as we look at these verses where God is established as the judge of all peoples, as a judge over all the earth. And rightfully so, because he is the one true God. He's the only righteous God, the only righteous judge. And therefore, he's the only one who created everyone and has the right to judge everyone. Further on down in the psalm, in verse 15 and 16, the psalmist continues. Again, the scope of God's judgment is not just against Israel, his people, but ultimately it's against all the earth. Look what the psalmist says. The nations have sunk in the pit that they've made, in the net that they hid. Their own foot has been caught. Who? The nations, not just Israel. Yes, Israel gets punished for her wrongdoings that she commits against her husband, Hashem, but ultimately it is the nations that receive this judgment. Look at verse 16. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment. The wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. Higgaion, Selah. There again, we see God as the righteous judge over all the earth, not just over his people Israel, but ultimately over all peoples. Amen? Amen. Let's continue looking at God as the righteous judge. Let's turn to the New Testament. There's so many other passages in the Apostolic Scriptures that I could look at. In the Tanakh that I could look at, but for brevity's sake, we'll just jump right into the New Testament, the Apostolic Scriptures. Let's turn to John 8:15. This is the one that shows up in CARM's chart. John says, speaking the words of Yeshua, speaking of his Father, Yeshua says, first of all, he's speaking to these religious rulers within earshot, but notice he's going to talk about the Father. He says, you judge according to the flesh, I judge no one. This is Yeshua talking to the religious leaders who were just ready to condemn the woman who's caught in adultery in this passage. I believe that's the context. Yeah, the woman right there in verse 10. And in verse 11, Jesus says, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. So it's within that context that Yeshua challenges these religious rulers. You judge according to by your eyes, according to the flesh, according to what's in front of you. You don't have a righteous heart. I judge no one according to that standard. But then notice what Yeshua says. He starts using some very peculiar wording, like he often does when he's speaking to the religious leaders. Right? He's always challenging them, pushing them to the very next level where they can understand what he's trying to say. He says in verse 16, "Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true. For it is not I alone who judge," watch this, "but I and the Father who sent me. So this is a little bit of an overlap verse. It is the Father who's judging, but it's Yeshua who's now saying, you know what? My judgment is true if I decide it. It's because I and the Father who sent me are both able to judge. It's not me alone who would be judging, but it's the Father in me who would be the one that's judging. So this is where he's going to start them out. He's going to challenge them. Of course, at the end of the passage, which I've gotten my little reference here at verse 49-50, so let me drop down there so we can see what one of his conclusions are. Sorry about that. He says, Jesus answered. All right, this is a really interesting passage, John 8. This should be made into a movie. I wish Hollywood would do it. He has this long interaction with these religious leaders, and they're just going back and forth. I mean, they're challenging one another, and Yeshua is rebuking them for their ignorance on true spiritual matters. And they finally conclude that he's out of his mind. He's demon-possessed. That's the only way he'd be coming to the logical deductions that he's coming to. What does Yeshua say to them in verse 49? Jesus answered, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. And then look what he says in verse 50. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Who's Yeshua talking about? He's talking about his Father, of course. His Father in heaven is the judge. Where would Yeshua get this theology? Did he make it up on his own? No. He got it from the Tanakh. He got it from his Father. Right? He knew who the judge was. He read the book of Psalms just like we looked at it earlier. God is the righteous judge of over all the earth, especially over his sheep Israel, but over all the earth. God is the judge. Let's keep looking. Let's turn to the book of Romans. Before we do that there, let me just again make sure you guys are understanding. Let's look at this word judge in John 8:50. This is the word krinon over here on the right side of the page. Krinon is the Greek Strong's number 2919. If I were to click on that link right there, I would end up with this page here. Krinon, the noun judge, is rooted in the verb krino, Strong's number 2919, which is the word judge. Strong's defines it as judge or decide, whether in a law court or privately, something to that effect. That helps word studies, talks about separating and distinguishing, making judgment either positive or negative, right? Render a verdict.